Okay, so now that I've got my thesis that establishes that the tree is like a member of the family and the overall meaning that heritage is more important than money, the best AP essays go through the poem from beginning to end instead of trying to organize themselves by literary device. So I'm going to start at the beginning of the poem and work my way to the end. So I'm going to point out that, and I'm not going to write out this whole essay because that'll take too long, so I'm just going to kind of bullet point it. So I'm going to point out that the poem begins with a somber tone as the speaker addresses this debate that she and her mother have about the fate of the Black Walnut Tree. And if I were to use that full sentence, I would embed this word, this quote, into the sentence by making it part of my own sentence. So I would say, the poem begins with a somber tone as the speaker addresses a debate she and her mother have about the fate of the tree. And I know that this is only one word that I've pulled from the poem, but I've embedded that word within my own sentence. And so I never want to just drop a quote in randomly. I always want it to be a part of my sentence. So this is how I'm going to start my first body paragraph. This idea of this somber tone, and this first sentence is, the poem begins with a somber tone as the speaker addresses a debate she and her mother have about the fate of the tree. I'm going to point out that in spite of the fact that the tree has been around forever, they're still trying to justify cutting it down and selling it. So some of the ways they try to justify it, and this is where I'm going to pull in my textual evidence to support this idea. I'm going to say something along the lines of, okay, well, in spite of the fact that the tree's been around for generations, the mother and daughter attempt to justify selling the tree for its lumber by describing its setbacks. A storm could churn down its dark boughs, and I'm just going to say churn down, and cause it to smash into the house. So that's one piece of evidence that supports the idea that they're trying to justify cutting down the tree. Another piece of evidence is the roots in the cellar. And then they also talk about the leaves getting heavy and the fruit getting harder to pick. So these are all pieces of evidence that support this idea that the mother and daughter are trying to justify cutting down the tree. They're saying a storm could churn down its dark boughs, smashing the house, and there are roots in the cellar drains. And so then I would need to explain that, and I would say something along the lines of how this imagery, because that's one of the devices I've decided I'm going to talk about, it implies that the tree is dangerous. And yet, in spite of this justification, these warnings still fall flat for the speaker and her mother. So they don't really believe that the tree is actually dangerous, and you can tell. Even though it appears that cutting down the tree is the most logical decision, the speaker can't come to terms with the emotional toll the loss of the tree would take. So the emotional toll is too great. So we have this idea that they want to justify it, which if it was just about this logical decision of money, they wouldn't need to justify it. They would just cut down the tree and be done with it. But they use these examples to try to justify cutting down the tree, and yet you can tell they're still not into it. They know it's logical, but the emotional toll is too great. And here's where a shift comes into play. The emotional toll is too great because of that quote that something brighter than money moves in their blood, and that keeps the speaker and her mother from deciding to sell the tree. So this brightness stems from the idea of her heritage. So now I'm going to move on from talking about the imagery of the tree falling down and the bad things about the tree to the positive images in the tree. Something brighter than money moves in their blood, keeping the speaker and her mother from deciding to sell the tree. So this brightness stems from the blue fields of fresh and generous Ohio, and the idea that the mother and her daughter refused to create an emptiness in their own and their father's backyard. So they don't want that emptiness. So the speaker ultimately makes this emotional decision instead of a logical one. She chooses to allow the walnut tree to swing through another year, to use another quote, in spite of the, quote, whip crack of the mortgage. So the emotional decision outweighs the logic of cutting down the tree. The speaker and her mother are financially desperate, obviously, or they wouldn't be thinking of cutting down the tree, but they're not desperate enough to sacrifice their heritage for the sake of paying the mortgage, because they recognize that selling part of their home to save the rest of their home is counterproductive. So the tree equals family equals home, and they just aren't willing to give that up. So unfortunately, this decision doesn't really bring relief to the speaker. They still haven't figured out how they're going to pay the mortgage. So that's where we have this tone shift from somber to resigned. The mother and daughter realize they're not capable of cutting down and selling this kind of symbolic member of their family. They don't want to crawl with shame at the emptiness that they create in the backyard, the emptiness the tree's absence would create. But they still haven't resolved how they'll escape that whip crack of the monthly financial obligations of the mortgage. And so while the walnut tree swings through another year with leaves and bounding fruit, the speaker and her mother are still left with no viable solution to their problem. In spite of this resignation, though, in spite of this, you're kind of left as the reader with this sense that the speaker and her mother don't regret their decision. They've chosen to remember their fathers out of Bohemia by keeping the tree, and then by extension, they're choosing to remember their heritage and to keep their heritage intact. And this exemplifies this overall meaning that heritage and legacy are much more important than money.